I'm Emily Freitag. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Instruction Partners, and we will go ahead and get started here. We were supposed to be joined by our colleague, Malika Anderson, our Chief Program Officer, who is unfortunately a bit under the weather. So it will just be myself and my dear colleague, Kelsey Hendricks, and I will hand it over to her to say hello.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelsey Hendricks, the Managing Director of Custom Services at Instruction Partners. I'm a former teacher, instructional coach, and system leader, and have spent the past 8 or so months with our team leading the work around figuring out how we address unfinished learning. Excited to be with you all today.
And for those that want to bring this chat into the Twitter sphere, we are at InstructUp and #InstructUp. So Instruction Partners is a group of educators that work with school systems, both districts, charters, and states to support effective instruction. And we work in a number of states and our district work is concentrated in the Southeast. And whenever somebody joins the Instruction Partners team, we ask them to share what's one nerdy thing that you love, because we call ourselves instructional nerds. So this can be something professional or personal. I will model this, and then I'm going to ask you to share one nerdy thing that you all love in the chat. This summer, I have 17 varietals of tomatoes growing in my garden, and I have a spreadsheet where I'm trying to track the sort of percent of good tomatoes per varietal. So that is my nerdy love this summer. What is one nerdy thing that you love? Please share in the chat. Yes, thank goodness for the cat photos in our life. Classical music. I suspect we have a few data nerds on this chat. Oh yes, Trudy, I like that. Gardening, geometry, and woodworking. Crossword puzzles. Oh, I'm like a third of the way through the Times puzzle from yesterday. Well, good company in all of these nerdy and fascinating things that we all can learn more about. So today's objectives, we're glad you all are here. We are excited to provide a webinar to offer some space to learn more about the Addressing Unfinished Learning Toolkit, which includes a number of different resources that you and your teams can leverage immediately to deepen your understanding of the rationale and the research behind the materials. And this will be a very content-specific conversation. So we are going to dig into the content-specific approaches to address unfinished learning and how they vary by different content area. To launch, I just want to start with a story. I am a former 7th grade math teacher. This was my very first group of 7th grade students. This was period 7, I believe. And as a young teacher, I, on day 1, gave a diagnostic to my students. And this was what my teacher prep organization had provided training around. I need to understand where students are. And I gave a range of questions. 7th grade math is, heavy on proportions, and you get into integers, and you start getting really into pre-algebra. I included questions that went back in time, including some questions on subtraction. That's a 2nd grade skill. And I had a number of students who were still struggling to subtract double-digit numbers. And so thinking that it was the best instructional decision I could make, I stopped and I went back, and I spent 2 whole weeks teaching subtraction with regrouping. And it didn't go very well, especially for the students who already knew how to subtract. It felt to everyone like this was baby stuff, and why aren't we moving forward? It really got the year off on a difficult management start. And as I looked back at the end of the year, I wished that instead of stopping and going back and focusing on subtraction, that I had instead realized that really the root issue was place value. My students were still struggling with place value. Maybe they were still dusting off some of the summer cobwebs, but a number of them were struggling with place value. And that instead of stopping and going back, that I had moved into integers as the curriculum planned and just built in the supports for those concepts as we went. I think it would have advanced them. And I was thinking about this story as COVID really shut everything down about 18 months ago. And there was a lot of talk about the double threat of inequity, that inequities already existed, that the pandemic was going to make them worse, which we have empirically seen to be true. But I then worried about this triple threat of inequity. What if our response as educators actually slowed learning for the very students who needed to speed it up? And so this led us to a searching range of conversations with researchers and practitioners in our Rethinking Intervention series. We've shared this series on a number of channels. Across those conversations, it really pointed us to content differences around the approach to unfinished learning. And we tested a number of those approaches with what we called our front runner partners this past year. So as we were learning, we would put it into action with partners. And the result is our Addressing Unfinished Learning Toolkit and findings. So a couple headlines, and then we're going to dig into specific examples. First big headline, while there are important and critical conversations happening about things like tutoring and how we can leverage after school and supplementary time, what we have found with our frontrunner partners is that so much of whether students advance or not is going to be governed by Tier 1 instruction. It is the primary lever for accelerating learning outcomes, not only because it is the most amount of time students are spending in a dedicated way, but also because it sort of governs the ceiling. It sets the bar for what students should be able to do that all of those other resources need to then reinforce. So Tier 1 instruction is critically important to addressing unfinished learning. Second big finding, we found that addressing unfinished learning while moving forward requires teachers to spend more time on priority units and priority learning, not less. There's actually a slowdown effect that we see when this is being done well. And I know the term accelerating learning is being used frequently, and I certainly understand that term, but the notion of acceleration, I think, has some risk given what we have learned about the importance of being able to slow down and spend more time on critical content. Third big finding, we've already referenced it. What you do for each discipline is not the same for other disciplines. There's a limit to how much we can generalize, and how we teach is shaped by what we are teaching. And so you'll see that we're going to share a bunch of different content examples. Fourth big takeaway is that leaders will need to provide teachers support, really developing the skill set, and in particular at the unit level. We found that there is a great deal of decision making that teachers need to do as they prepare for a unit. And there will be time implications for leaders around how they organize that time. So those are the 4 top line headlines. But what I would lift up more than those even is that this graphic. As we've said, it is an unsimplifiable equation. We cannot say do A, B, and C, and that's what you do to address unfinished learning. We have to really understand the dynamics of the content area that we are trying to support. So what we found is that in math, reading comprehension, and in science, moving forward into grade level content while embedding support for the content specific learning progressions is going to be the best approach to address unfinished learning. However, in reading foundations, we do need to go back and target each of the missing skill sets. So there is more of a stop and go back approach that we have found in reading foundations. Final macro thought, all of this work of addressing unfinished learning is much more easily done when there is a high quality curriculum as the anchor for instruction. That creates a common language that teachers can use to really talk about learning targets and the progression. And so we're not going to go into much depth here on the work around how to identify and support high quality curriculum. But thankfully, we do have a whole website dedicated just to this called the Curriculum Support Guide. And so what we will speak to from this point forth in the session is really going to all depend on having a high quality curriculum. I know that states, districts are in very different places around this. We have seen that this has actually been a time of a lot of like, we really need to get a curriculum so that we can support students effectively in addressing unfinished learning. And so would certainly encourage folks that want to dig into the curriculum support guide more to let us know. But we will move forward on the prerequisite of there being a high quality curriculum in place. Okay. So we have shared with you all by email the Addressing Unfinished Learning Toolkit. It was emailed before the session. And in the toolkit, there are a number of different components. There are high-level strategies for addressing unfinished learning for each content area. There are content-specific guidelines and customizable worksheets that we hope schools literally can make a copy of in Google Docs and then start using. And then there are step-by-step curriculum-specific examples for how to work through the content prioritization in action. And we are going to get into some of these content-specific tools right now. Okay, so each of the component parts has a bunch of different tools. I'm going to start by talking through math, and we're going to talk through math in a little bit more detail than we do the other subjects, just as the first upfront example. And then we'll talk about reading comprehension, reading foundations, and reading science, and science a little bit in reference to how it's similar and different to math. So in mathematics, I get to start with math. I love math nerd. So we definitely found that in mathematics, unfinished learning is better supported when it is embedded within the relevant grade level units. So rather than taking a stop and go back remediation approach, that moving forward and embedding support will support students more effectively. As we talk to a number of researchers, many heroes of mine in education, Deb Ball, Robert Berry, Uri Treisman, Bill McCallum, it was just so interesting to hear people talk about the structure of mathematics and how math represents these kind of columns of big questions that connect to each other, and how much mathematics as a discipline is really about connecting different representations and ideas about things to each other. And so a particularly helpful metaphor that came out of this for us was this notion of a load-bearing wall. So it's almost like learning in mathematics is like building a construct, and you can make a lot of different connections in a lot of different ways, but there are some concepts that serve as kind of load-bearing walls that you want to make sure those are reinforced before you level up to the next level. For example, students cannot subtract if they don't know how to count backwards. However, that doesn't mean that you have to introduce fractions before decimals or decimals before fractions. So this idea of getting really clear on what is a load-bearing wall becomes a critical concept as we think about how to address unfinished learning. Because what we're going to want to do is provide teachers additional flex time to address those critical load-bearing walls in the context of grade level instruction. So let me talk through a fourth grade math example to try to bring this to life. I'm going to use Eureka or Engage New York as our curriculum example here. So in fourth grade, the first thing we want to really understand is what's the most important content in fourth grade. And we know that fourth grade is a power play year. We are learning, we're really solidifying multiplication and division. We're really digging into fractions. And we know that success in algebra actually comes down to how well we do with fractions. So this is a critical year. I want to locate first, where is the major work of the grade? In which units that I am teaching is there the most important content? So we're using student achievement partners, priority content here for this one. I know a number of states have put out their own priority content guides, but we can see unit 1, 3, 5, and 6. Those are the units that have the most important work. And I'm going to try to add more time to those units. We want to have more flexibility because we know students are going to have unfinished learning needs. And so I want to have more time. I'm going to find that more time by combining lessons in the other units. It doesn't mean we're not going to teach the metric system, for example. We will still teach the metric system, but it will get less attention than fractions. Which is part of the kind of necessary prioritization and judgment that will go into addressing unfinished learning. So if I read through all of the units, I can see, okay, these are the units that I want to increase by a certain number of days. This is where I'm going to decrease. It happens to be in fourth grade that you can move unit 4 to later in the year as well. I've gotten all of that from reading the unit notes and from the Student Achievement Partners guide. That's what I've looked at so far. Okay, that's the work at the year-long level. Now that I've said to myself, okay, I have my updated scope and sequence for the year, I'm going to take a look at that first unit and really dig in to say, what's my plan for that unit? And the mental work we found goes into addressing unfinished learning is to first identify what are the key standards in that unit. What are those foundational standards or load-bearing walls to the standards of that unit? And then to develop a pre-unit assessment that allows me to understand, do students have those load-bearing walls? And so if we look at fourth grade, we're looking at a number of the NBT standards. I think here we used Achievement Network's foundational standards tool to then look. I think the coherence maps from Student Achievement Partners is another tool you can use to say, okay, what are the foundational standards to these grade level standards? And then the guidance from Engage New York said, can this be addressed within grade level work? Or is this something that actually we need to teach separately? So we're seeing that there's some second grade standards, there's some other fourth grade standards, there's some third grade standards that are all kind of prerequisite to accessing those grade level standards, some of which can be addressed within the grade level work and some of which need standalone attention. So then I'm going to look at, okay, for those that need the standalone attention, how would I know if students are coming in with those load-bearing walls or not? And here we're going to come up with a fairly open-ended assessment. So this isn't a pre-test, post-test. This is not a red, yellow, green chart, right? It's like a few open-ended problems that not only give me as the teacher a sense of who has this standard and who doesn't, but also what thinking is going on. The more open-ended these are, the more I'm going to understand what the challenge really is. And so as the kind of criteria for success, we're looking at, can students round? Can they add and subtract using place value operations? And then the key problem solving strategies in this first unit are going to involve the vertical number line and the tape diagram. So I'm going to give students some problems to understand how are they coming in with those. Probably worth also noting here, we want to really activate what we know from research about belonging and psychology, and giving students a test that they are not going to be successful at is a surefire way to make sure that we're activating their own deficit thinking about themselves. So we want to make sure that these open-ended pre-assessment questions are really kind of friendly questions and framed in a way that allows us to understand what students are bringing in an asset-based way. Okay, so I've given this assessment. I can take a look at student work, and the decision tree that I can now flow through is, did 100% of students get the load-bearing walls? If yes, great. Move right on into that unit as planned, and you can go right ahead. If no, then we're going to have to understand what was it that led to their the areas that they're still struggling with, and what instructional strategy will match that issue. So if it's a problem-solving strategy, like the tape diagrams or the vertical number lines, I can embed that into the grade level work. It might just mean I have to switch out a problem here or there. Maybe there was a horizontal vertical number line that I'm going to use in my modeling as a vertical number line instead, to sort of activate memory or to introduce that vertical number line. So that would be strategies within the grade level work that I would think about. If it is the concepts, the rounding, the adding and subtracting using place value, I might need to stop and really make sure that we're attending to that. If it's a couple of students, maybe it's a bridge task and a small group. So when I say bridge task, it's sort of like, let's remember how we do this before we launch into the lesson. If it's a larger number of students, maybe it's a mini lesson or a full lesson. And if we are seeing many students are struggling with adding and subtracting using place value operations, then what I might do is take that additional time that I've already built in, because I have the flexibility, and I'm going to go back to the second grade Eureka unit on the lesson that so let's say it's 2 NBT 1. I'm going to go find the second grade lesson on 2 NBT 1, and I'm going to pull that into my 4th grade unit. So before we go into day 2, I'm going to do a day on that particular standard. So that's the full kind of arc of decision making that we found goes into addressing unfinished learning. It is not simple, but it is doable, and there are lots of good tools and resources out there that can help teachers through this. What I hope you'll notice is how much time and energy really at that unit level goes into really thinking about what instructional decisions need to be made. I see a quick question in the chat about whether this is applicable for TEKS and Texas as well, and I think it absolutely is. What we're referencing here is really about how math is learned. Some of the tools that we've used, like the coherence maps and such, might not explicitly stem from TEKS, but I know that there are a number of tools and resources that TEA has also produced around some of this. And so it might, every state will have its own sort of flavor, but the thinking of saying to myself, okay, what's the most important content? What are the load-bearing walls? How do I understand if students know those? And and how do I build in time to be able to be reactive? Would hold up no matter what. Before we flip to science, I do just want to show you one of the resources in the toolkit, the PLC agenda template. Thank you, Vanessa, who just linked that in the chat. I'm going to pull this up too. So this is a Google Doc. So if anybody wants to use this, you can just go ahead and make a copy of it, and then you'd be able to edit it. And this is a sample of like essentially a meeting for a unit launch. So if you are about to go into grade 4 unit 1, these are the metacognitive guiding questions that we found are useful for teachers to think through. And then we've timed them out. Of course, all of that is adaptable to your particular school context. But this allows teams a starting point to use to really work through the work of that unit prep. Okay, that is math. I am going to hand it over to Kelsey for science. Oh, I need to keep.
Did you reshare your screen?
Share my screen though, don't I?
Thank you.
All right, over
Great.
to you, Kelsey.
Thanks, Emily. So one thing that's similar in science to the approach that Emily just shared about math is that we are moving forward into grade level content in science when addressing unfinished learning. Unlike in math, however, in science, we do this with support for the core progression of ideas, because ultimately great science instruction already attends to unfinished learning. Science is all about, if you go to the next slide, Emily, science is all about instruction that's built on questions. And we know that this year there might be more questions in science classrooms because of gaps from unfinished learning. But we want to be leaning into those questions rather than simply giving students answers or facts to memorize, as we may have been taught in our own science experiences. And when we think about attending to unfinished learning this year and what effective science instruction looks like, it's really thinking about how we hear from students, their understanding of phenomena to drive exploration and pull students into the content with that effective instruction. And so when I'm thinking about planning to address unfinished learning in science, we're gonna go through this process that you see here. And I'm gonna take the example of being a teacher who's planning for a unit around the concept of electricity. So as a teacher, my first action would be to identify the anchoring phenomena that would drive the conversation and discovery throughout my whole unit. If I'm thinking about electricity, the first thing that comes to my mind is a big old lightning storm, which I know we've all seen before. Then, because I know that science is a progression of core ideas, I want to think about what I would expect my students to have encountered previously related to electricity. I also, though, want to be identifying what students are bringing into my classroom by eliciting student thinking. When I'm doing that, it's a type of assessment that is really light and targeted about what students know about this phenomena of the lightning storm that will help me in giving them access to that grade level work. And then I can take and use those two pieces of information, both the progression of core ideas and my students' understanding of the lightning storm, to integrate coherent science experiences that would address any identified gaps or prerequisite knowledge that they would need to access this grade level. That might mean that I'm building in some background knowledge, but ultimately I'm letting the questions about the phenomena of the lightning storm drive my instruction. And because of this approach to planning unfinished learning in science, we're really going to be asking teachers this year to figure out how to prioritize their content around phenomena. And in our toolkit, we have a video of our science leader, Dr. Jessica Henderson-Rocket, walking us through exactly how to prioritize content in science. Vanessa is going to share the link in the chat with you so that you have it top of hand, but it's a great resource to follow along with Dr. Henderson-Rocket as she walks through that process, and one you could turnkey with your teachers in your own buildings. Oh, Emily, you're on mute.
I was just going to note, we're going to put all the links in as we go. Every link we're putting in is also in the toolkit itself.
Thank you.
So
Emily,
you don't need to sort of track all of them.
The second key resource that I'd point you to in the toolkit related to science is Solidify. And we created Solidify a couple of months ago to support instructional leaders who might not have a science background, know what to do to effectively support science instruction in your buildings. And I want to point you to a few key components of Solidify that I think are just really fantastic as you think about leveraging this in your own leadership. The first on page 2, you'll see every module in Solidify is centered around a wondering in the same way that we want science instruction in classrooms to be centered around wonderings for students. You know, we learn the work as instructional leaders by doing the work, and this in Solidify really models that for science. On page 5, you'll see the next extension of that, which is that each module has a set of tasks for leaders to answer at their own pace around the wondering question, again, about science instruction and how we're supporting teachers in our buildings. And finally, and I think probably will be exciting to see for folks on this call, on page 11, Emily, is a bridge to practice. So each module ends with resources to share for leaders who are using Solidify to share with their teams in a professional learning setting inside of these bridge to practice materials. These, again, are turnkey resources that instructional leaders can use with their staff as they're thinking about leading science instruction. So that's the second big content area of science. Again, you heard some things are similar to math, like moving forward into grade level content, while how we're supporting unfinished learning relies on that science specific progression of core ideas. The two remaining content areas of reading, and we're separating these into two, require a more nuanced approach and two distinct approaches. And that's because of what we know about teaching students how to read. We already know a lot. And based on Scarborough's rope, we know that getting to really skilled reading requires both attention to language comprehension, which is like our vocabulary, our background knowledge, and our understanding of the text. And it requires us to also have word recognition. This is our phonemic awareness, our ability to decode, our ability to understand, like read sight words, right? And these two areas together braid in an intricate weave to help us get to skilled reading. So as a result, our approach inside of the toolkit, as Emily mentioned before, is that our resources are broken down into two groups. One, you have foundational literacy, and the second is reading comprehension. We're going to dive into foundational literacy first, and then we'll talk about reading comprehension. So we already know a lot about how we support students in reading fluently. We know what is involved, from listening to rhyming to how we support students in recognizing phoneme blending. And we know actually in what order they should be taught. So we know that it's better to learn consonant vowel consonant words like cat and bat before we learn blends and digraphs like fish and blab. And these intricacies of the sub-skills along this progression should happen not haphazardly, but actually in a very intentional and sequential order. Ultimately, when we're thinking about how to teach students to read fluently, we know what, we know how to teach it, and we know when to teach it. And those three things informed our approach to addressing unfinished learning and foundational skills. So that means that unlike in math and in science, where we're exclusively moving forward into grade level learning with support, in foundational skills, as Emily mentioned at the beginning of our webinar, we are taking this stop and go back approach. We want to ensure that students receive their grade level skill in tier 1, but that there is explicit time to go back and achieve proficiency on missing skills. And we're going to dive into what that might look like with an example of how we can do that through learning targets. In order to stop and go back and address the missing pieces of the progression, as educators, we have to know exactly where every student is. And ultimately, the pace of our learning in reading foundations is contingent on our ability as teachers to set really explicit and measurable learning targets. These learning targets are short and like, what do I need my students to learn in the next 2 weeks? And I can use those learning targets, while individualized for students, to engage them on a team effort, right? This isn't a solo mission. Teachers can use their learning targets to group students based on where they are in the progression. So let's look at what this might look like if I am planning for small group instruction for a group of students who are at the late pre-alphabetic phase. And I'll note, Emily, if you go to the next slide, that this example that we're going through here is grounded in the expeditionary learning curriculum. So you're going to hear things like microphase, and this is specific to EL. And this group of students who's engaging in the EL skills block is focused on that late pre-alphabetic phase. So in addition to really knowing specifically over the next 2 weeks what we want this group of 4 students to learn in their small group instruction, we also, if you look to the far right, want to know that Braden is focused on specifically on the letter F. It's these like minute instructional decisions and ways that we group students that are going to support us as we move students along the progression towards becoming fluent readers. And again, like microphases may not be the term that everyone on this call uses because it is EL specific, but I do want to name that having a really strong foundational skills curriculum is essential to this work. Like you are not going to be able to address unfinished learning in early literacy without one. It is both the foundation of our own understanding of the progression to fluent reading, as well as the assessments within the curriculum are really how we understand where students are along that progression. It's how we get to the point where we can say, I have a group of 4 students who are at the late pre-alphabetic phase, and here are the learning targets that they're engaged in over the course of the next 2 weeks. And the approach that we just talked through of addressing unfinished learning in early literacy is all about what's happening in the individual classroom. But we know that that can't be the only place that we think about and talk about early literacy. Creating proficient and skilled readers requires this system-wide approach. It's ultimately a team sport, from the head of a system to the team that selects the curriculum to the decisions that are being made around how time is spent in a building. And all of those decisions across the system need the same level of precision and attention that we're asking of classroom teachers in knowing where their students are. And so for that reason right there, the system-wide approach, we at Instruction Partners are doing a pretty extensive pilot study right now. We're in year 2 with multiple partners working to learn alongside systems that are intent on building a comprehensive program on foundational literacy to make sure that all the pieces are where they need to be, and we're then providing some support and helping them get there. We would invite anyone who has any interest in learning alongside of us, particularly in January, to connect with us or share your interest in the chat, and we will follow up with you individually.
And so I just add before we go into comprehension, the toolkit has a number of resources that it links to around early literacy, including video examples of a walkthrough around this expeditionary learning example. But we do have a number of additional resources coming. So the toolkit is essentially phase 1, and we are going to be building and continuing to deepen on that. Early literacy is a place where we're going to be releasing a lot more in the next few months.
Thanks for mentioning that, Emily. So we're going to switch now from early literacy, reading foundational skills, to the second part of Scarborough's rope, reading comprehension. This is a totally different ballgame from early literacy. In this second part of the rope, we are moving into grade level content while embedding support for fluency, vocabulary, background knowledge, and syntax. And if you go to the next slide, Emily, this is because ultimately, addressing unfinished learning in reading comprehension is about providing access to complex text. We are figuring out how to address unfinished learning in the context of the knowledge demands of the text, meaning that our materials are organized around text versus being organized around skills or standards. And this is a key difference, I think, that you're going to hear about reading comprehension than you heard about math. And the approach for planning for reading comprehension instruction that addresses unfinished learning takes this 3-tiered approach. At the year-long level, our goal is to adjust pacing guides to build in additional time for teachers to really provide additional targeted support within their daily lessons. And with that additional, if you go to the next slide, Emily, with that additional time and space, teachers can then strategically and intentionally build background knowledge, promote fluency, vocabulary development, support students' fluency, and untangle complex syntax in service of the text that they're going to access within that unit or the module, whatever it might be. And inside of our toolkit, We've got resources to support planning for each of those strategies, but I want to explicitly take you to vocabulary first. Marilee Springer says, not only does background knowledge grow in the brains of our students through their experiences, but the vocabulary words that are stored as a result of such experiences provide avenues to comprehend the curriculum from the text, as well as lecture and discussion. And so these 4 components of background knowledge, syntax, vocabulary, and fluency, right, are essential components of addressing unfinished learning. And in the toolkit, there are teacher-facing tools for each of those components. And I want Emily to go specifically to the vocabulary guidance one, which Vanessa is going to share in the chat. These, again, teacher-facing, if you'll go to page 3, Emily, right where the pedagogical strategies start, right here. So if I'm a teacher, if I'm an ELA teacher who's planning for my upcoming unit, I'm thinking about the text that's central to this unit. And I recognize from some data that I've captured about my students that most of my students are going to have challenges with the meaning of important words or phrases in the text. I can actually take our vocabulary guidance tool here and work to plan using the pedagogical moves that you see here on the right to attend to the root cause of the learning need of students in my classroom. Again, with the goal of providing access to the grade level complex text with which we're engaging across the course of the unit and the module. Because we've got the additional time and space from our pacing, we can spend the time that we need to provide that access. And again, as Emily mentioned earlier, all of the resources that have been shared in the chat today are included in the toolkit to address unfinished learning. And so in reading comprehension, similar to math, similar to science, we're moving forward into grade level content with specific content support for addressing unfinished learning. And so these are the 4 main content areas, right? Math, science, reading foundational skills, reading comprehension, and that's a lot. Would love to hear, before we kind of share how we might be able to support you and your teams as you're thinking about engaging in this work over the course of the year, would love to hear in the chat what is really feeling doable and exciting about this approach, and then to unfinished learning, and what concerns you as you think about how you move forward into the school year.
Let's start with what feels doable. What feels like I can go do something with that. We'll give people a minute to just chat it in. Christine, we will get to that in a second. Administering pre-assessments in math does feel doable. Having the conversation around pacing. The PLC agenda felt doable. Great. Okay, so some of the tangible resources feel like they're landing best. What feels, what questions do you have, or what feels concerning? I'll give people a second to chat. The mindset of adjusting pacing. Finding time to support leaders, to support teachers. Reading comprehension. Where do I start if students need support across all? These are really helpful to see. How do you address unfinished learning prior to a unit when districts have their own plans that do not necessarily align with what we're hearing? where it will be addressed within the unit versus what they need to add in. Yep. And then addressing poor quality tier 1. Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm just thinking about Ryan's last comment here about the mindset shift. Several years ago, when we did the research that led to the curriculum support guide, we interviewed a number of districts that had moved to higher quality curricular materials. And for some, it was going really well. For some, it was much more challenging. But across the board, we heard so many people say that their teachers had said, I didn't think my students were going to be able to do it. And I was really surprised by what they were capable of doing as part of like almost as a feature of the curriculum implementation journey. So I think that does just point back to how critical having the tier 1 instruction that actually sets the bar at grade level instruction really becomes to so many of the challenges we then see around addressing unfinished learning. I think if we go into it much like I did in my own 7th grade experience with this approach of I have to meet students where they are, as opposed to looking at the curriculum and saying, where do I need to get my students and what is the best path to getting them there? It leads us to just a very different course of action. And it is a mindset change. I think so many of these comments really reference how many mindsets we have at work that may sort of reinforce this remedial approach. I think a lot about the zone of proximal development as sort of like a unhelpful metaphor in this scheme of addressing unfinished learning, because actually, well, number one, I think that's just a misunderstood set of research generally, but I also think that we are limited by what we think students can and cannot do more than our kids are limited by it. And so what I think does resonate is, well, let's give it a go. Like, we're going to make more time. Something about having more time in the pacing guide to be able to flexibly adapt, I think has also been sort of psychologically helpful to folks as they dig into unfinished learning. Let's make some more time. We know we're going to need it. We don't know what we'll need it for, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to move forward. I think the other mindset in terms of like adjusting pacing, gosh, I don't know, go do a PhD dissertation on this, but I think there is such an instinct as educators that we have to cover everything. That can make things like even the conversation about priority content feel like really complicated. But I do think, I also think teachers know that they do need to dig in more deeply and they want time and space for it. And I do think this becomes something where leaders and leadership messaging can do so much to change teachers' sort of appetite. So if leaders say, look, it's really important to me that we nail the most important content of the year, and I think that's the best way we're going to set our students up for success, that can really instantly change the dynamic of a conversation with teachers. I don't know how useful any of that is to these big and very complex questions. But I think that we are all digging into this together. And to that note, we will close with a couple of minutes just to talk about how we are working with schools and systems to support this and to get at some of the questions about how kind of specific we can get. So as we shared, there are just so many different resources linked within here, some that we've created, some that others have created, and you know, worth a moment just to thank everyone who's been doing really good thinking in this space. We certainly hope that you'll share the toolkit with your networks, with your staff. If you're on listservs, feel free to put it out there. We do see a number of schools leveraging these resources, in particular in content-specific PLCs and in their instructional department meetings. We at Instruction Partners are supporting different groups in different ways. So Kelsey leads our custom training team that works with both districts and states, and also with other organizations that provide support to teachers, whether that's like a regional service office, et cetera, or other nonprofit organizations. And so we've been doing a number of training with those orgs. We also do side-by-side partnership support for school districts. That includes traditional public schools as well as charter schools. And the cycle that we use for that partnership is an observe, plan, develop cycle. So we start by watching instruction and really understanding the state of what's going on in instruction. And then we work with the leadership team to create an improvement plan for instruction, leveraging these resources as a core part of that. And then we do provide training to teachers and instructional coaches and leaders on how to use these tools. So we're doing everything from really kind of long-term planning sessions with teachers and leaders, to unit planning sessions with teachers and leaders, to observing PLCs, et cetera, with an orientation towards helping the leaders lead that work in an ongoing way. And then I will hand it over to Kelsey to talk a little bit more about the customized training that we have been digging in on.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So our custom team has been providing customized learning series for folks, as Emily mentioned, around the country, between districts and other organizations as well as states. These offerings are content specific, targeted towards teachers and leaders who are responsible for, decision making around addressing unfinished learning in the classrooms and content areas. In these learning series, we dig into what is priority content in service of unfinished learning. What are the unit planning actions that, as Emily mentioned, like the unit is the real, unit of change here. And then what are the content specific lesson strategies that teachers can employ to really address the unfinished learning they're seeing. And so in a follow-up email today, you'll receive a link to schedule time with me if you are interested in learning more about how we could bring this work to your teams and your teachers and leaders. And then with that, would love to give folks just an opportunity of ways that you might be able to connect with instruction partners. So you can visit our website. We encourage you to join our mailing list. Emily sends out wonderful emails with lots of great resources, and then you'll get a ping from us every time we release a new set of resources. And as Emily mentioned, to come over the next year, lots of early literacy work. And then finally, you can connect with us on social media and tweet at us at InstructUp. We've got about 5 minutes remaining before the 1 o'clock Central Time.
Yeah, I want to just reference one or two quick things in the curriculum support guide, because I'm just seeing some trends and questions. I do think that where the strategies to address unfinished learning kind of rub against potentially outdated ideas about what good instruction should look like. There are a number of resources in the the curriculum support guide around establishing the vision. Like, what does good math instruction really look like? And I would just point people that want to dig in more there to these vision statements and tools and the metacognitive questions around sort of how do we set up our vision for what good instruction looks like, and our core beliefs about how students can succeed towards that vision, because it does feel like that is ultimately kind of what we're coming back to, and everything is then, including how we address unfinished learning, we can then root back to what we understand to be our vision for math. So there might be some additional resources there. Thank you for asking about history and social studies. I think the reading comprehension strategies are probably the most proximate to social studies, because that is about building knowledge. Science, a little bit, although in science, the framework for science definitely drives towards a more of a phenomena based. And I think we are planning to try to get a few additional resources around science and social studies. It varies so drastically by state that there aren't as many national resources in this space, but I would point history and social studies teachers towards the reading comprehension strategies as the most proximate. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to put my email address just in the chat. If there is anything y'all want to talk about, let us know. Partners.org. I can type. Kelsey, maybe you want to do the same, and y'all can look for a follow-up email with a copy of this recording, as well as the toolkit, as well as some follow-up links as is useful. I hope this can be useful as people are planning for this really critical and complex year. And I hope we can just be together in the learning as we all continue to advance. Addressing unfinished learning is always going to be a critical educator skill. And I'm just hopeful that this can be a chapter where we all learn how to do it in an even more robust way.